This episode is all about the regulation of new technologies such as blockchain and the basic ideas about it. I speak with Michael Kolain, a lawyer from Germany who is deep into this topic as a scientist. Have fun.
Welcome to The Blockchain Lawyer, a podcast on technology and law. Dennis Hilleman is an accomplished lawyer with over 13 years of experience and a passion for creating a better future through blockchain technology, cryptocurrency, and other disruptive innovations. All statements expressed in this podcast are the opinions of the host and his guests only and are in no way legal or financial advice. And now, here is your host, Dennis.
Hello everyone, what's up? This is Dennis Hilleman. Welcome to this new episode of The Blockchain Lawyer. And this episode is pretty cool because we've got Michael Kolain, a lawyer from Germany who's working as a scientist on very basic questions of regulations of new technologies with us. We'll be doing an interview that will be particularly looking into basic questions of if we should do regulation at all, who should be doing the regulation, the state or non-state organizations, what we need to consider, what special things we need to consider with blockchain technology and other technologies. And Michael is just not only an expert, he's also a very, very nice guy. And I think we had a splendid interview. So here we are. Michael will introduce himself as well and have fun with this podcast episode. Michael, hello. Welcome to this podcast. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, cool to have you on board. Michael, I've been knowing you now since 2018, but please let the listeners know what's your passion, what you're doing, who are you?
Well, yeah, I'm Michael Kolain. I'm a German lawyer and been researching on new technologies and the law from a public law perspective for around 5 years now. One of my first interests was blockchain technology. Been doing extended research on this topic with IT expert Christian Wirth. And we started also a standardization project on blockchain technology, DIN-Spec 4997. And I work in research in my main job. I'm a coordinator and research associate at the German Research Institute for Public Administration, which is a state-funded research institute with a focus on the public administration, public sector, and the transformation of that. And our part is the digitalization. So we look at the transformation of the state in the digital age, working there with Professor Mario Martini, who's my supervisor and at the institute. And on the other hand, I do my independent research on blockchain under the label of privacy by blockchaindesign.com. And it's mostly on the intersection of law and IT. This is the things that I'm interested in, work interdisciplinary and find solutions how to have a digital society which has a high amount of freedom and that we're used to, and that also respect human rights.
How did you come into blockchain? I mean, there's not many lawyers into blockchain. Most are, especially in the STO offerings, ICOs, in the financial aspects of blockchain. But you're deeply into different fields like regulation and constitutional matters. How did that happen?
Well, the interests merged, and I'm interested in new technologies and how we can provide privacy in a digital world has been always interesting me since I graduated, and I've been going into this research department on the digital transformation of the state. And the interest in blockchain actually came through friends. It didn't come from the legal sphere. It came one for all from my good friend Christian Wirth that I researched on, that he told me, he's an IT guy, and he told me very frantically and with a lot of euphoria about this new technology called blockchain. Basically, we have a technology where we don't need banks anymore and we can do payments by Bitcoin back then. And he showed me the white paper and he was really interested in it. And some other friends also shared the same interest. And for me, I've always been interested also in the constitutional system of a federal state, of decentralization of power, and how the German constitution is doing that. So decentralization as a way to make societies more democratic has been always in my key interest, and to delegate power to the lowest level that is possible, and give the people the input to make decisions on a political level from bottom up has been always a very key problem of that I was thinking about. And I also worked for a time after my graduation for an NGO, which tries to promote direct democracy in Germany and Europe. And so the interest on decentralization merged with this new technology. And to be honest, it took me a while to understand why it's so disruptive, or seen as so disruptive. Pretty quickly, I stopped being interested in the cryptocurrency part of blockchain, because I realized it's just a new measure of speculation. It's just a new way of creating value. But I was more interested and realized, okay, the technology behind is interesting because it can serve decentralization without centralization of power in one entity. And that's what I looked into more, and less the cryptocurrency part of it.
So I understand correctly that the part about blockchain that you really like is that it gives power back to the people in a decentralized way?
Well, yes, it's not really only, it's on one side, it gives power to give influence on what happens to the individual user. But on the other hand side, it also gives the potential to distribute power among different actors, and avoid centralization, because I think centralization of power is one of the key problems that democracy is trying, and the constitution is trying to solve. And at the same time, in the digital sphere, we saw from the free internet of the 90s also a development towards centralization in the hands of big corporations. And then also in the banking crisis of 2008 and the reaction through blockchain on Bitcoin on that, I realized, okay, too much power in one hand is a problem, and blockchain community is trying to solve that into the IT world and give us different protocols and different ways of interaction, which give me as an individual user and all the other individual users more influence on what's happening and less these powerful actors. So that's basically the interest that fascinates me about blockchain technology.
Yeah, I can only agree. As you know, I'm also not so much into the whole crypto space, though of course I follow it. And I also very much like the idea of distributing power. But nonetheless, I mean, our topic today is regulations of such new technologies such as blockchain. And if we talk about regulations, it comes from central authorities. Isn't that something that looks a little is a little bit odd? Do we need regulation of blockchain at all, from your point of view?
Well, I think talking about regulation, we have to first understand what we mean by that. I think in the more Anglo-American world, regulation is more the regulator, so it's the supervisory body that is regulating something. But I personally mean it in a more broad sense of giving rules, of even making laws, more of the lawmaking aspect. And I think, like for most things, there should be a kind of legal or normative framework on how we as a society, we need a consensus on how we want to use certain things like pharmaceuticals, cars, smartphones, and also value like even currencies. So for all of that, we have to find a common understanding of how we want to use it. And in the democratic process, then we make laws and say, okay, these are the basic guidelines that you have to follow if you want to go into any of those sectors. So for me, this is regulation is just basically a understanding of society of how we want to use technology. In the case of blockchain technology, I don't also see it as like a central authority giving rules, but kind of it's giving a framework of this technology to be used in a certain way and to find a mix to reduce the risks and to use the chances. And this is the process that we're in now. And it shall also lead to some frameworks of normative understanding. In case of blockchains, like how much transparency do we want? How much automatization of processes do we want? How much human influence do we want? And also the question is like which intermediaries that blockchain can dissolve do we actually need? Because one of the things about blockchain is, and which is I see sometimes as too radical or maybe too simplistic, is to say we should get rid of all intermediaries and give the influence only on the technical level. There certainly is legitimate centralized powers. And here we can do centralization, but in some ways it's really useful to have an intermediary on certain things. And here we should embrace it and say that's a good thing. And then use blockchain to make it maybe more transparent what's happening, but we don't need to have a peer-to-peer world on everything. I think this would be a step back. So it's really also an economical thought of seeing, okay, where should the individual be there? Where should we have platforms? Where should we have intermediaries? And how can we control power? And from these questions, all taken together, that's the process where we're in now. We shall lead into some legal framework, but we're not really there yet, I feel.
Very, very good. What are the key points or the key elements on that blockchain technology needs regulation from your point of view? What do you see as the big threats that come with blockchain and that we maybe need to regulate?
Well, I can talk about the risks. One is like transparency. I mean, if you look at the Bitcoin protocol, you have a very high level of transparency of the transaction data. Still, of course, it's reduced to the pseudonyms of the keys, the cryptographic keys, but we have all the data which comes up public. And in some other cases, we don't want that high amount of privacy, that high amount of transparency, and we need to feel like what's the right amount here in which use case that we're working on. And I mean, the developments are already going in this direction of zero knowledge proofs and other ways of putting, let's say, privacy layer on top of the data layer that we have. But and the other thing that I find worthwhile to consider is, and it strongly depends on the context you use it, but if you use blockchain technology and smart contracts, you assume that the problem you're trying to solve can be put into a deterministic rule set. And the rules that we use in law are not always this deterministic. So by programming a problem into a smart contract and trying to automatize it using blockchain technology, you can simplify it and thus create new problems. So we should look from a complexity point of view of which problems are very suitable to be solved using this technology, which mostly gives us the chance to store data in a shared way without any individual which is sharing the data to manipulate the data set. Like, where do we really need this kind, and where can we solve it just through a server or like even a protected silo? So this is the understanding that we have to find out, and kind of changes the way every time we implement technology. We can now have another tool that we can use and say, maybe this distributed ledger can help me in this way to avoid a problem that I couldn't solve before. And so it's feel more from this technological point of view on how is the most efficient way of the most privacy-friendly way to solve my problem. And there I want blockchain, and on the other sides, we don't need it. So I don't want to hide the problem and say we can solve all our problems, but to say where are the use cases where we really can take the best out of it.
Thank you very much. Very cool. And when you look at blockchain and the complexity of the matter of the technology, I mean, we both been like working in the blockchain field now for a while, and we both met at the German Institute for Standardization and for working on an industrial standard on blockchain. But many lawyers don't understand blockchain. Do you think that actually our state system is able to regulate blockchain well, or should there be a different approach in regulating blockchain?
I think we should not choose the top-down way of kind of giving rules. And actually what we're doing with our standardization project is just the opposite way, to use the knowledge of the people actually working with it to create something bottom up and say, okay, these are some common rules that we can agree on. And we shouldn't just say, okay, it's people in the parliament, please give us rules, because you need a very specific skill set and interest also to understand the intersection of law with new technologies. You have to enjoy to work interdisciplinary. Many lawyers, law itself is complex enough that you can only work with that. So you need, but also this interest in how does this technology work and what can I do with it? What's the legal and societal implications of it? And from this point, you can start thinking and getting a point of view on these topics. And you're right, this interest is there in many lawyers. In the process of working on these topics, I see how many people are actually interested in it, but it's maybe not the majority of lawyers yet. But we also don't need the majority of lawyers to be blockchain experts. It's enough if there are some who can put it into words that the others understand it. And get an idea of the problem, and that there's enough scientific and journalistic literature for people to understand the thing. And at the same time, blockchain technology as such is so complex and so abstract also, because in the end, the law always regulates use cases, or courts decide about use cases. And we both need the very abstract understanding of what DLT, like distributed ledgers, can do and help, but on the other hand side, also we need these bottom-up movements who say, okay, we want this decentralized technology to be accepted into society. We want it to be integrated in the legal framework, and we actually want to improve the level of privacy that we have at the moment and put it to next level through blockchain technology. Because this is, I think, the point how you can convince like large parts of society to say, look, if you use this solution, you will have more control over your data flow than before. And the need for trusting technology is, I think, super high at the moment. And so this bottom up can prove, okay, look what we can do with this technology. And what we're trying also to do with the standardization is to say, what is the legal framework that we need around to shape this technology in a way that is privacy friendly? Because we see it also with the internet as such. Technologies, I think, always have the potential to be used or in a good way, or like to be misused also. And this is very strongly depends on how the debate in society is going and which actors are kind of jumping onto the technology. And so for me, as lawyers and people who are interested in human rights, using this technology and kind of shaping it also from early on to get to its highest potential is super necessary, because in the internet we saw it also, we all believed in this connectivity, we can talk anonymously with strangers all over the world, and now somehow it led to a kind of surveillance system in the hands of a few actors. And in order to prevent that, that the technology is driving away in a bit from the common good is, I think, the duty of the law, of lawyers. And that's why we should be interested in that and try to shape it in a way that is good for society and all members of society in the end. And so that's why I think as we should also be interested and try to shape it with our perspective, and thus help also the IT community to understand what are the legal implications and societal implications of what they do, because often their job is to solve a certain problem and make a very difficult code. They don't always have the huge perspective on it, and that's where lawyers can help.
Oh man, there were so many things in that. Let me start by this. I remember when we first met. I think it was like in March 2018, I think, or February 2018. Can't recall. It was like the first meeting at the German Institute for Standardization for me. It was the start meeting, and there were like all these IT folks, all these younger people than me. Of course, Michael is also very much younger than me, but there were all these young people, and Christian Wirth was there too. You just mentioned him, and he like gave an graphical idea of where he wants to go with the industry with the standard that we created. And I was like thinking at some point, man, I don't understand a single word he's saying. And I must admit, I learned so much from working there. And so what you just said, that we need to work in interdisciplinary teams, that lawyers and ITlers or techies, as I like to call them too, need to talk to each other and need to understand each other. I think that is so true. And I really also agree that we need the bottom-up approach, because from the top-down approach, that will be very tricky. We've got a lot of lawyers sitting in the ministries, also in the parliaments, and not so many ITlers, not so many engineers. And while I assume they have good intentions on making good regulations, I often think they lack the experience. But do you see that is actually like happening now, apart from what we did together? Do you see other projects that are similar, other strategies, maybe from Germany, from the EU?
Well, I think in research it's already happening in the scientific world, but I see generally this also when I see it, my younger colleagues who are coming out of university. There's people who say, okay, I studied law, now I will study also IT. There is people who can, it's, I think it will be a more and more normal skill to be able to code and to write computer programs in larger parts of society, because at some point in schools, we will learn how to do basic things. So the skill set is raising, and it's getting less and less an only expert thing to be able to work with software. So on the one side, we have more and more young people growing up into being much more competent using technology than my generation and the generations before were. And I see also this interest happening of exchanging thoughts. So for me, working with these techies was always interesting, because the approach of solving a problem and thinking in an abstract, complex system is very similar between the law and IT, and the need also to solve something till the end and find this clear solution at the end also combines us. So actually the methodology and also the analytic thinking that is necessary to work with languages. I mean, at the end, it's a computer language, and we work with like natural language, but this is what we're trying to do to make decisions. So there is like a lot of same methodology that we use, but we use totally different words, and we use different tools to get to the end. So what I see is like when you just put them in the IT lawyer and the techie into a room for two days, both of them will get out and will have learned so much. So this is totally necessary to have that more, but I feel it's already happening. It's more like on a friendship base. It's how it started for me too. Just kind of talking with friends who are interested in this, or who are maybe techies. And I hope there will be much more institutionalized ways to discuss it, even in parliament and in politics. But also they are seated in the ministries. They're having these innovation hubs. They're having special departments where they are trying to get the techies who are interested in the public good into the bureaucratic structure, which is not always easy, because unfortunately the bureaucratic structures and the public sector is not the most innovative sector in Germany. It's really hard to attract people, innovative techies to this environment, I have to also say.
That's very true, but I agree that it's a little bit changing. I mean, even the firm that I'm working with is like very much looking into legal tech, and we see young colleagues coming with not only the knowledge of law, but also able to basically code a little. I mean, that's the new thing, obviously. And if legal tech gets even bigger, then there will be more of them. And it will be perhaps at some time a special subject at university for law students that they can choose to participate in to get their degrees in that. But before we continue talking about regulation as such, I never talked actually about the details of the standardization that we created at the German Institute for Standardization, because I was just a participant. You were actually one of those who initiated the project. Would you like to tell the listener about what is it about, what problem tackles it, and of course it's complex, but maybe a little insight what the outcome was?
Sure, yeah. I can, for me, it's the most natural way to explain why we did the standardization is to start with our previous research. And what has always combined me and Christian Wirth to research together was kind of to find a common language between our disciplines. What we just talked about in the last question was to kind of know what the other discipline is talking about, to find a solution, like find a software which is adaptable to the law and a law which is transformable into code. And looking into this, we found out that standardization, we came up to the point that we realized, okay, standardization is the attempt of the technical community, engineers, to find a kind of framework or like minimum rules of a certain technology, to define it, to kind of put some normative reference on it. So we realized, okay, standardization, that's quite interesting. And also the GDPR using standardization or certificates as a way to specify the law. So we said, okay, we have these very general rules in the GDPR and in many other regulation, and we want somehow to implement it into a software product in the end. So how do we do that? So we have to kind of find layers to specify it more and more. And standardization is one way to do that, because it's not binding law, but it's like the attempt to specify something in the framework of the existing law. And then we just said, okay, why don't we make a standard ourselves to understand the methodology of standardization and the potential of bringing lawyers and the technical community together, also as a tool of really like play what you preach, to say that's what we need, so let's do it. And the idea behind the standardization, what it tries to tackle is to find solutions that arise from the incompatibility in many ways of GDPR regulation, which mostly thinks about centralized server structures and not of distributed ledger systems, to describe it in both languages, both for the techies and for the lawyers, and say these are the biggest problems here on this community, and this is the biggest problems here, and then try to find a touching point between that. So doing really privacy by design in its core sense, to think about the development while developing new technology products, think already of the legal implications, and try to integrate it into the solution from the beginning, instead of just in the end doing corrections to a system which is maybe already flawed from a legal point of view. And this was basically the idea, to make it easier for blockchain products on the German or European market, follow the standard, to see, okay, here are your problems that you have to solve if you want to be compliant with data protection regulation. And with this idea, we went to the German Institute of Standardization and started the inspect process.
And what did you personally learn from that? And what do you think was the best part of it all?
For me, it's really the people I met and their perspective, to see how complex these problems are if you take different disciplines inside. Because talking with you, it would be very easy to talk about blockchain technology, maybe because we have the same kind of background, legal background. We would maybe agree on many things. But if you talk to someone who maybe doesn't even understand your expert language, your legal language, you have to really simplify it, and you have to go to the really core of it and then realize that the other person has the same problem. They have a very complex background, very technical language of programming. And for them, it sounds always weird what we say, and the opposite. So this really sitting there and understanding each other and then putting it all together in a document. This was before it was just an idea to say, oh, we should have this more and more. It was just two friends talking sometimes about tech and law and writing some papers. And then we did it in a big group. So this was the fascinating part, that it's actually possible to find a common understanding between these disciplines. And we will see once it's published, how useful it will be for the community. But I hope it will be, and also will help other people to see how can we tackle these problems on the intersection of law and the technical world.
I totally agree, and I'm very curious to see what comes out of that. Going one step ahead, what do you think? We tackle privacy now and transparency. What do you think? What are the greatest challenges that we have with regulation of new technologies today? What other topics do we have to face? What do you think? Which liberties from us are tackled by new technology? I think you've also been working in artificial intelligence, as I understood. Is that right?
Yeah, right. I'm trying to look at these new digital technologies and look at them a bit like risk technologies that we know before, like nuclear energy or genetic changes that we can make nowadays, or pharmaceuticals or nanotechnology. So we have these new technologies which give us a lot of opportunities to improve our society and make the world a bit better. But at the same time, they have inherent risks that we somehow have to tackle. And in the digital world, we need to tackle certain things that we constantly collect data, because we need data to feed the algorithms to solve the problem. But this exceeding amount of data which is collected also has this huge potential of surveillance, and also of kind of manipulating people by giving them only certain choices. I mean, this is for me one of the key difference of the analog and the digital world is, in the digital world, you can only do what is foreseen. So the paths that you can take are limited to what the programmers have given you. So with Bitcoin, you can maybe exchange a token, but you can, not do other things. So you're limited always in your choice in the digital world to what is given to you. In the real world, you could still not buckle up in your car and just drive without it, and you will get a fine. But in the digital world, your car will not even start driving if you're not buckled in. So there's a huge limitation of freedoms that we often can't control, because we lack competence of understanding how these IT artifacts work, and we often have no influence on it because it's a commercial product that we have no insight in, and that we also cannot configured to our own interests, because they have been configured to the interests of those who are offering them to us. So what I'm very interested in is how to get this power back to the individual user to use really the technology. I mean, that's what technology has always been for, is to make our life easier and more controllable, and not coming into a new kind of power struggle where we are more the object which is kind of nudged in certain directions, and more the subject who uses its free will to do what we want and to get where we want, not be limited in our freedoms on the long run.
So do you think we need the regulation for the benefit of the people, or is there also the regulation for the benefit of the state? Meaning, for example, do you see that maybe administration, governmental organizations would use blockchain technology if the legal framework was there?
Well, it's kind of hard to say, because on one hand, the public administration has to follow the reality of the people. So if everybody is using a smartphone, and the public administration is saying, well, through your smartphone, you cannot get in touch with me. You still have to fill out these paper forms. There's a big gap between the state and society. But on the other hand side, I don't think it's the state who should be at the forefront of technological development, because the danger of it going wrong is, of course, quite high. So it's rather to let it fail in a system where just a few consumers are concerned is something different than when you, as a public administration, implement something and suddenly there's a big data leak of all that concerns all citizens. I mean, there's a huge the loss of trust happening. So I think the government and the state should not be at the forefront, but they should also be interested and curious about the new things and implement it as far as they can. I'm not sure if regulation is the biggest obstacle or if it's more like the attitude that, change can also bring too many risks. So let's rather stick to the old way of doing things, because digital technology comes with a lot of other disruptions, not just putting the analog procedure and kind of putting it into a PDF or putting it onto a computer, but it gives this huge potential of agile processes. But for that, you need the people to able and willing to work with it. And so also that makes it always a bit slow, because if you implement a new technology and the people working with it don't want to use it or cannot use it correctly, then also the impact of it will be very slow. So there's always this kind of problems from like the which come together. Regulation can make it easier, especially the German administration, which is very rule based. I think if there's someone saying, okay, you are allowed to do it, then a lot of people will also use it. If it's unclear, if it's even legal, then public administration will most likely not implement it at all. So we need the regulation, yes.
Should regulation focus more on the threats of a new technology or more on the possibilities? I think that's a discussion that I often see now in parliaments, that especially members from liberal parties claim that we should not forbid new technology or not restrict it in some areas, but focus more on empowerment of new technologies. Others, however, say, as you underlined, that new technologies have threats and that we, of course, must assess such threats, that we must look at such threats, for example, for privacy, and therefore don't go the empowerment way, but more rather the restriction way in certain areas. What is your point of view on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's the legal methodology to first look at the risks and try to reduce them. I think it's also a bit a criticism of the legal thinking in it to say, okay, this can go wrong, this can go wrong. How can we avoid things going wrong and give rules that avoid that something goes wrong? I mean, this is kind of the way lawyers think. And empowering, what does it mean? I mean, mostly it means funding, research, and development on these technologies. This is something I guess also the government should strongly do, to put their own impetus on how these technologies develop and support research, and also neutral research, which is not only profit oriented. So this is for me the empowerment part, and research on the legal ethical implications, and not leave all of that to the private sector. But I also don't really understand what would it be to empower. How can a law empower a technology? Like for driving, of course, if you drive a car, you can run over somebody or you can kill yourself. But what kind of rule would I need to empower driving? The positive things, I can go very fast from A to B, but what would be the empowering way of regulation? This is something I don't really get from people making this argument.
I understand that very well, and I agree that we first need to look at the risks, because that's what we do as lawyers, minimize the risk for everyone. However, some also claim that any regulation that you do on new technologies is lost or old-fashioned the moment it comes out, because technology of today, especially in the digital sector, is so quickly moving that it doesn't make actually sense to approach regulation of technologies, or at least not approach the specific regulation for blockchain, but rather than have other rules that are in general and not like limited to one technology, for example, GDPR. And instead, what is your point of view of that? Do we need to regulate specific technologies, or more like give out basic rules that apply to a wider range of developing technologies?
Yeah, I would rather say the second. I think law should and has to be abstract. Like blockchain technology maybe itself is not abstract enough. For me, the phenomenon that needs to be regulated more specifically would be shared data structures. Usually we say, okay, there's one controller and he has everything in his hand. All the processes, all the data somehow is controlled by that person. But especially distributed ledger and blockchain gives you the possibility to have more people having different responsibilities. And this, of course, makes the whole liability point of view much, much more important. So we need joint controllership, more people. What does it mean, actually? And how can we use this decentralized peer-to-peer computing things? Like who's responsible for what? This is very unclear. So this is the topic that we would need more regulation and new ideas and more creativity, because the concept behind the law is that there's this one monopole or one central actor who can control most of the things. And this is not true anymore. And if we focus on that, we leave a lot of potential behind. So in this way, I would say, yes, we need regulation also to empower these new technologies to use their chances, if we understand that a certain phenomenon has changed. But I would not say let's go into the individual technologies and regulate them in a way, because this is actually a question of product development, but give the product development more values and guidelines of how to solve it. I think there's also a huge need in the IT sector. And even, if you look at the Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress, he's saying, please give us rules. We don't know how to handle all of this. So this is where regulation has to come part and say, okay, these are the principles that you should follow. This is something you have to bear in mind. It's how you solve conflicts of interests. If transparency goes versus confidentiality, how can we actually move ahead? And this is, so we need to come from an abstract point of view. And not go too specific. But this is the question where this boundary is drawn is, of course, very difficult and very different in different technologies.
If we assume that there were such general guidelines like we have now with the GDPR, but also in other areas, be it blockchain, be it artificial intelligence, who do you think who should supervise that? Should it actually be the state? And if so, what do you think are the challenges for administrations when they have to be the police of the new technologies?
Well, yeah, I think they shouldn't be the police of these new technologies. I strongly believe in civil society as a construct that brings out innovation. So it's not just I don't think the ministries are the ones who should bring that, but it should be the civil society concern, like being research, being NGOs, being companies. All of those have to find the forms and methods of a debate on how to use it and test it and experiment with it. And then it's a democratic process that should also come up to the parliament, to ministries, and so on. But without the civil society kind of testing, using it, there's no sense. So I don't think also the supervisory bodies, at the end, when there's a law, of course, they have to implement the law, but we should not also give them the whole burden of saying, okay, here politics solve all our problems, but rather also see who are the actors who can contribute and form a participatory process in society that gives a way to balance out the interests. I know it's a quite abstract answer, but I think it has to also strongly come bottom up and also from a corporate responsibility for what you do. And yeah.
I think it's totally fine because, of course, there was a very complex question. And corporate responsibility is a huge topic that I think will grow very much in the future, not only by the legal framework, but also by the pressure of people, be it when it comes to privacy, be it when it comes to sustainability and taking care of the environment. So you're absolutely right that this should be a bottom-up process. One thing that I wonder, however, is the following. You named, for example, technologies before, like medicine, like nuclear power plants. And when we looked at that were all topics that were regional or national. For example, it's a regional topic where I'll build a power plant. It's a national topics which medicine can be distributed and sold in Germany. However, when we now look at blockchain and artificial intelligence and other technologies that come over the internet, I don't think they are national anymore. Like I can actually, is the national, what do you think? Who should be this supervisor? Where should be the legislation? Where should it come from when we have such technologies?
Well, that's pretty hard to tackle this problem that in a globalized, digitalized world where everything is somehow connected and where one individual legislator or regulator cannot control everything, it's very hard to look for the kind of superpower to regulate it. And then we look at the United Nations, they try some things, the European Union and so on, but it's hard to find this framework. But if I think more from an economical point of view, I think that we also should think about industrial politics and these questions together. So in the end, the digital technology that we have at the moment or have had in the past is mostly being developed without the values that we're trying to promote or the human rights in mind. It was mostly developed with a profit-oriented approach to say, how can I use the most data to get the most insights to make the most money out of it? So it's also, if Europe, for example, or under the European legislation, we create products, really products which are safe, which are privacy friendly, which are functioning. It's not just concepts, so really need software parts and open source that actually be usable and are very efficient, but also respect user friendliness. I think it will be really good for also the for exporting it, because who doesn't have an interest, like customers around the world, in having these technologies? But right now we don't have the choice to use a very safe social network, or like have a smartphone which is give the possibility to safely store personal data on it. We don't have that. So by developing this, we're super late, of course, like it should have been from the beginning, but like this, if you think industrial politics, it could be also things made in Europe could become something like the renewable energies with solar power, wind power coming from Europe, or in this way also Germany, can also be a huge financial profit because it actually fulfills the needs. All around the world, people don't want to be surveilled in the digital sphere more than necessary. And so I think by developing these products, you already give a strong impact. And at the same time, of course, you have to work on the regulatory framework of it. But this will be left to, the nation states for the moment, and maybe have some framework on the UN level. But of course, this is a slow process.
But I think it's a very cool idea that you just put out, that regulation in this way, or at least the problems that are tackled with regulation, can lead to ideas, innovations that then like spread all over the world. And the idea is not so far away. If we look at EU GDPR, which was the basic foundation for the new California privacy rules. So it's not that everything that comes from regulation, especially from the EU, is considered bad. And it also changed a little bit, at least, the big players like Facebook, Amazon, and Google when it comes to privacy. So Yeah, I can very much follow you on that idea, and I really like it that you put it up. So that puts an optimistic view, also point of view, also on regulating new technologies. So we could talk about this for hours, but I'd rather invite you again to tackle some subjects. Let me ask you, what's your plan for this year? What's new? What's going to happen this year, 2020? Which topics are you currently looking into?
Well, mostly in 2020, we have to follow up on things that have already started. One thing is that I'm working on with great interest is data law, is to understand how we can build like a legal framework around data, maybe in a way comparable that we have around things, like natural things, like in a way like property rights, sharing rights, distributed rights, and the legal framework for actually what I talked in the end is building these new technologies, which are user and privacy friendly, and what kind of legal framework do we need for that in a creative way, not just adapting the ideas from the past, but really maybe developing new categories even in the law, which are more compatible with the technical reality. So this is will be a very big interest of mine, and I would also like to do more things like this, more talk about things, get into discussions, go to conferences, and also write an article here or there. Maybe also for a wider audience. This is something I would like to do, and get in touch with more people also outside the academic world to see what's on their mind.
So how can people get in touch with you if they want to invite you to their conference and have you speak on the topics you just mentioned?
Well, yeah, they can just write me an email, Google my name, on my work address of the German Institute of Research and Public Administration, or my private email, which is michael.kolain, Kolain, @posteo.de.
Very cool. And of course, I think they can find you on LinkedIn, if I'm correct.
Right, yeah. LinkedIn, I also have a Twitter.
Cool. So you're all on the bad social media as well. But anyhow, there was a fantastic interview, and thank you so much for the insight, Michael. I hope I can have you back on the podcast in the future. And I hope that you will have a great year with all the ideas that are floating through your head.
Well, thanks, for the invitation again. And I'm glad to be able to stay in touch and come again to the show. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Bye-bye for now, Michael, and until soon.
If you want to learn more about Dennis, please visit his website, theblockchain.lawyer, or connect with him on LinkedIn or Twitter. Until next time, everyone,